Hi.
Hi again. John Wesley Bready in this Freedom Whence, also called in England and the colonies, England before and after Wesley. He's detailing the Puritan purge that happened in the 1660s, and the purging is not over yet. So he takes up the reaction of the 2,000 expelled Puritan pastors, what happened to them, and what happened in the next generation to England. But the 2,000 expelled pastors were not the kind of shepherds who forsake their flock when the wolf raids the fold. Most of them were compelled at once to seek new means of livelihood. Nevertheless, they continued to meet with their people in private houses and to conduct worship according to the dictates of conscience. This audacity was answered by the Conventicle Act of 1664, which punished with fine, imprisonment, and transportation on a third offense all persons who met in greater numbers than 5 for any act of dissenting worship. Transportation at this time, moreover, might well mean literal slavery, for in 1685, following Monmouth's rebellion, the 800 victims sentenced by Judge Jeffreys under James II to transportation were, quote, presented to various courtiers who sold them to slavery in West Indian plantations, unquote.
Then in 1665 came the Great Plague, which mowed down in London alone 100,000 citizens, 1 in 5 of her population. This ghastly visitation was enough to strike terror into the stoutest hearts. Parliament hustled off to Oxford, and large numbers of London clergymen joined the popular exodus, fled the city for country air, thus forsaking their flocks and leaving them without religious rites. Expelled Puritan divines at once stepped into the gap, ministering to the sick, burying the dead, and consoling the bereaved. Not a few went further, believing that at such a time the spiritual law superseded all state enactments. They entered the churches whence they had been expelled and conducted services for their quondam parishioners.
The fear and fury now roused by the revival of a foe supposedly crushed registered itself in the 5 Mile Act, that is 1665, the crowning infamy of the anti-Puritan code. This act presented a rehashed and highly spiced statement of the bitterest clauses in the foregoing legislation, and on the expelled clergymen refusing to subscribe, as all did, they were forbidden under penalty of £40 and 6 months' imprisonment to approach within 5 miles of any corporate town or borough or of any parish in which they had previously taught or preached. End of quote. The act applied to schoolmasters as well as clergymen. Hence, torn and tortured by persecution, Puritanism was severed from its spiritual and cultural roots. Not for 25 years, till the passing of the Toleration Act by William and Mary, did Protestant dissenters enjoy even the semblance of corporate liberty. And then the measure granted was small. Remembering that for a considerable period, more than 4,000 Quakers and Baptists, to say nothing of Presbyterians, Independents, etc., were in jail through the fury of this anti-Puritan purge. Is it surprising that in later and a more industrialized age, Puritan dissenters often carried the doctrines of laissez-faire too far, that is, laissez-faire, the economic policy, which, yes, can become extreme.
Professor G.M. Trevelyan, assessing the results of this code of persecution, points out that the Puritans were not only excluded from the universities and from their natural share in social and political influence, but were actually driven out of polite society. The loss inflicted by this code upon Puritan culture, Trevelyan thinks, was never completely made good. Puritans for a generation were as Babylonian captives in their native land. The spirit of the Cavalier purge is reflected by the fact that even Milton was hurled into prison. Dire difficulty was experienced in procuring publication for Paradise Lost. It was ordered to be burned by the common hangman. And Milton, finally reduced to a state of penury that it compelled him to sell his library, could get only £5 for the copyright of the immortal Puritan epic.
So one of the all-time masterpieces of literature almost didn't get published.
Yeah, boy.
Such was the outcome of Charles II's sworn promise of liberty to tender consciences. That's the king who had been brought back with that pretense that toleration would be the norm in England from now on. A century later, John Wesley, on reading Wodrow's History of the Sufferings of the Church of Scotland, wrote, quote, "It would transcend belief, but that the vouchers are too authentic to admit of any exception. Oh, what a blessed governor was that good-natured man so-called King Charles II. Bloody Mary was a lamb, a mere dove in comparison." End of quote. Admittedly, Charles II was not directly responsible for this persecuting purge. A pensioner of France, he had his own secret, sinister schemes, which partly were thwarted by the anti-Puritan code. Nevertheless, mercy to Protestant dissenters held no place in his plans, and the unparalleled licentiousness of his court put all virtue to rout.
So he now goes on to the second tragedy, the expulsion of non-jurors. The second tragedy takes us to the year 1689 and 1690. Though not fraught with such fatal consequences as the code of persecution, it left behind it a livid scar, not to be healed for several generations. Though James II had ingloriously fled the country, the Jacobite party contended that the crown could not be forfeited, and among the most vehement spokesmen of that party was a group of ultra-high church clergy, who claimed that James II was still the Lord Anointed, and therefore that William III's title to the throne was pretended. Among these ecclesiastics, moreover, were several prominent bishops and many zealous old Catholic priests. William's position at best was difficult. He wanted to grant liberty of worship to the oppressed Puritan dissenters, and so offered to excuse the national clergy from taking the oath of allegiance, if the church dignitaries would agree to the abolition of the persecuting code. To both hierarchy and squirearchy, however, this proposal smacked of treason. The oath accordingly was administered, though to make it less objectionable, the words rightful and lawful, as previously applied to the sovereign, were omitted. The upshot was that 8 prelates, and over 400 clergy of the extreme right wing refused to subscribe. Hence, on August the 1st, 1689, they were suspended, and on February 1st, 1690, I'm getting ahead of myself, all were deprived of their livings.
Among these non-jurors, that is, the people who wouldn't take the oath, as the new outcasts were styled, were such courageous leaders as Sancroft the primate, and such saintly souls as Bishop Ken the hymn writer, while on the accession of George I, they were joined by the famous mystic William Law. Among them, too, were the chief exponents of the patristic, sacramental, and Old Catholic conception of the Church, as distinct from the Protestant, prophetic, and New Testament conception. In brief, 400 spiritual sons of Laud, that is Laud the High Churchman who had opposed the Puritans. 400 spiritual sons of Laud suffered in 1690 for conscience sake the same fate as the 2,000 spiritual sons of Luther, that is the Puritans, suffered in 1662. And the latter expulsion, like the former, bore poisoned fruit. With this second tragedy, the church found herself shorn of both left and right wings. Zealous priest and flaming prophet were now cut off. The moderate, reasonable men, the time servers, self-seekers, and pluralists were all left, but the wings of faith were gone. Had the national church studied how best to extinguish all spiritual fire within the realm and to crush all crusading initiative, she could have devised no better plan than these two tragic expulsions. The ability to temporize, that is, compromise, was stimulated. The ability to aspire was stultified.
A quaint instance of the heated feelings roused by the non-juring expulsion was later to manifest itself in the Wesley parsonage at Epworth. Though a moderate high churchman, Reverend Samuel Wesley, John's father, in family devotions prayed regularly for William III as king. Shortly before William's decease, however, he discovered that Susanna, his wife, was not saying amen to these petitions. Taxing her for the reason, out came the truth. The daughter of Dr. Samuel Annesley, that expelled Puritan, often styled the St. Paul of nonconformity, was now at heart a non-juror. Unrepentantly, she asserted that William at best was regent, not king. Samuel Wesley consequently left the house in a huff. He would not share the bed and board of a disloyal wife. So for some months they lived apart. Then conveniently William died.
William the King died.
Yeah.
Regent.
And with the accession of Anne, Queen Anne, the Epworth parsonage was again harmonious. Jacobitism, is that how you say it?
Jacobism?
Yeah.
Or is it Jacobitism?
Jacobitism.
Okay.
The divine right of kings and the non-juring expulsion divided many parsonages besides Epworth. The succession issue, in fact, divided the nation. Nothing changes, eh?
Why do you give her that section?
So, what we learned is that ever since the Reformation, that is approximately 150 years at this point, 170 years, England's been fought over by Catholics and Protestants, and now between Protestants and Catholics.
Yeah.
And everybody's taking sides. Well, I couldn't relate to this when I first read it 30 years ago, because Canada and North America seem to be at peace, but I sure can relate to this now.
Yeah, yeah. Political issues of recent years have divided families and caused people all kinds of problems of not being able to connect with close friends and family members.
We heard lots of examples of the election of Trump dividing families right down the middle.
Yeah.
Even man and wife. Yeah. So, yeah, it's all very relevant today, and I think we should probably say a word on behalf of the Puritans, because they have a notoriously bad rap, as all Christians are starting to do now. But in the old days, it was when Protestants talked about extremists, Puritan came to mind, and it somehow became synonymous with Victorian. Now the Victorians were not like the Puritans. The Victorians can rightly be called prudes, but the Puritans, on the other hand, were very earthy people, but they were also very, very dedicated to the point of being easily accused of fanaticism.
If you're a witness, an ex-witness, or a witness, that's one of the first prejudices you should just dump and read about them to find out what they really were like.
And they were phenomenal in terms of their impact upon society in the brief time they had reigned in England, politically or in terms of their impact upon the Church of England.
Yeah.
Fantastic influence. To this day continues.
A real concern for for the reforming of character in people.
And a great impact, by the way, not only on politics, but on growth of democracy and on science. I didn't know that at all when I was a witness. We wanted to link a connection to this. Brady's brought up the Great Plague, which came in 1665, right after the expulsion of the Puritans. We don't know if this is God's answer to these developments or not. We can't see behind the scenes, but a lot of people at the time thought something's going on here, and God doesn't like London. 100,000 people died in London alone. So we wanted to link the response that Brady talks about here, the Puritans, to how they handled the plague and how the normal English clergy handled the plague. Well, that's very much like what Rodney Stark says in The Rise of Christianity. We'll link to a video on that. Rodney Stark, not Snark, points out that the Christians of the 3rd century in Rome and the Roman Empire responded much differently to the plagues coming upon the empire than did the religious, the others. And it was even noticed by the emperor in those decades of the 3rd century.